Thanks for having me here today. So you'll notice the title of my talk was What a Fair and Equitable Classroom Looks Like. But now I'm asking this as a question. What does a fair and equitable classroom look like? Because I honestly don't think it's my place to dictate that, because we need to decide what that all looks like in the context of our own institutions and our own student populations that we're teaching. So hopefully I'll present a set of ideas with you that might result in your personal reevaluation of what that might look like for you. Um, so um, so ultimately, I think what this all boils down to is, why are we in the classroom? Like, what is the goal of our teaching? And so actually, if you could humor me, for those of you, on a voluntary basis, if you wanted to write in the chat box, just a phrase or a sentence about why you're teaching, like what is your goal as a teacher in the classroom? Again, so whenever I'm going to ask a question like this, I'm not going to ask a question that has a yes or no or a right or wrong answer, and then tell you what the right answer is. That's just not how I roll. But I'm interested in your perspective at this point, because they're all valid. So I'll give it like 20, 30 seconds for chats, comments to roll in. There we go. To get students engaged and interested in biology. I want my students to improve their problem solving skills and their confidence and problem solving abilities. So, engagement, problem solving, knowledge, skills, courage, become creative adults, help support, improve our broader society. Right. So all these are legit. All these are valuable. And so one way uh, is a classroom meant only for teaching? Could be meant for exchanging knowledge? That's a great question. So ultimately, um, the the answer to this question, I believe, flows from our teaching philosophy. I was teaching for a very long time before I even was aware of what a teaching philosophy is, or the concept that we should have a teaching philosophy. Oftentimes, when you look at job applications, when people are applying for faculty positions, often the statement of teaching philosophy or teaching interest says mechanistically what we do, but often, or how one goes about approaching one's goals, but not, well, what is your ultimate goal and how or why you're teaching. And so one lesson I learned from this was, early on in my time at Dominguez Hills, I was deeply involved with training future teachers of K through 12 students. And so there were people who were in our credential program who had science degrees, who were preparing to enter the classroom, and we were interviewing them to enter our Noy Scholars program. And so one of the questions that the program always asked was, so what is your teaching philosophy? And most of the people participating in this interview who are entering the program had exactly the same teaching philosophy, word for word, which presumably they got from an instructor or a class that they just had, because otherwise you'd have such similarity. But I can see why they all adopted this particular philosophy, because it was so critical for the environment that they were entering to teach. And that teaching philosophy was, every child deserves the opportunity to learn. And that's because they were going to be teaching in South LA, in the Los Angeles Unified School District, where there's a lot of inequity, a lot of students coming from environments where they haven't been challenged to learn, where there are very low expectations placed of these students, and a lot of turnover in teaching. And so they often didn't even have teachers who were well established. And so their philosophy is, every kid in the room deserves the opportunity to learn, which I think was ideally structured for that environment. Um, but also, I think, just an important central philosophy, no matter where you are, that everybody deserves the opportunity to learn. So, then I'd like to lead to the next question I have, a general question. Should we treat our students the way that we would want to be treated? Now, I'm not asking you to answer this question, because I do believe there is a particular right and a particular wrong answer. So think about this for a moment. If we were in a room, I'd have you chat with your neighbor. But I would say, should we treat our students the way we'd want to be treated? And I would say, no, we should not. I think the golden rule is inappropriate for a college classroom. We should not endeavor to treat other students the way that we would want to be treated when we were in college. Well, why is that? Because as people in higher education as professors, or graduate students, or whatever our role is as an instructor. We've gone through college and ended up becoming the people to teach college. We are not the average student. We may or may not have been average at the time, but just because we were a particular way doesn't mean that we should be treating other people based on the way that we were back then. And we can't even possibly imagine where our students are coming from, what their backgrounds and experiences are, make those assumptions, and then treat them they would want to be treated. So instead, we need to assign them a higher level of respect. We would treat people with the respect that they would expect to receive. But our idea of the respect that our students might expect from us could be different, substantially different from what we imagine that is. So I'm going to share with you a couple thoughts from people who are, far deeper thinkers than myself. From Paulo Freire. There's no such thing as a neutral education. Education either functions as an instrument to bring about conformity or freedom. So depending on how you are teaching, depending upon the choices you make, depending on your teaching philosophy, either you are teaching students to conform or you are teaching to liberate them. Along a similar vein, Audre Lorde has said the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but ultimately they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And so if you were to interpret this in light of higher education, the master's house is the reigning power restriction system and philosophy that structures higher education, right? And so our university, the way the university is designed, you could argue based on this, and potentially depending on what Paulo Freire is saying, that we are in a standard classroom training our students to support the master's house, to become a part of the system, to teach them to conform. And so what can we do to teach students to be liberated? So what is the consequence of most teaching at the college level? I would argue that we are preparing our students to conform to the conventional template of what a successful student looks like, right? So ultimately, we set up a class, and students experience this many, many times throughout their time in college, is there's all these classes that have expectations of them. And most of these classes have similar expectations. You should take these exams and get these grades. You should write these essays and get these grades and, meet these particular conditions of the rubric. And, have all of these expectations of students. And so what structures that template are the hoops that we expect students to jump through to earn grades, right? So because students are doing things to be able to pass our classes. Even if some students aren't planning to get an A, they're still planning to pass, which means they are going through the actions and doing the things that we are expecting of them. And so ultimately, whether or not, if we are expecting students to do things for our classes, then ultimately what we are doing then is training them, giving them experience, having them jump through these hoops. I mean, you jumping through hoops is not necessarily an inherently bad thing if you need to jump through hoops. Right? If you're training someone to jump through hoops because that's what their career looks like, is more hoop jumping, then that makes sense. But we need to have a more structured idea of what we are expecting from our students as we're designing our curriculum and as we're working with them. So I'd like to introduce to you a wonderful metaphor for teaching and mentorship from Beronda Montgomery, who's a plant scientist at Michigan State University. So she was giving a presentation to a bunch of microbiologists. And so one thing that microbiologists who who typically grow microbes on medium would like to point out is that most microbes you cannot culture. So the world is filled with bacteria everywhere, but only about 5% of them or so will actually grow in medium. And so once we started being able to sequence things and the PCR revolution and all that, then we would discover that there's all of these microbes that exist in the world that we never even saw or paid attention to because they didn't grow in culture. And so she said that in our higher education environment, in our graduate departments and in the classes that we're teaching, what we do is we are breeding a homophilous environment. So homophily is like we're breeding people who all are similar to and alike one another. And so ultimately, the way that we teach our classes and the way that we support members of our community, what we're doing is we're culturing them based in a highly similar environment. And so only individuals who can perform in the particular way that we are expecting them to perform. And the basis of that performance is often based on their capability, based on prior experiences or skill sets that they already bring with them. So instead of culturing the full diversity of people who come to us, instead what we're doing is we're laying out a medium which then filters out, right, what will grow. And so individuals who can fit and grow in that medium will flourish, but individuals who do not fit in that pre-existing mold simply will not flourish. So for example, like thinking about someone who, another illuminating moment I had in teaching, early on for me was when I was working, one of the most, I wasn't one of the most talented, but so many of the students were talented. One of the students who learned the most, who experienced the most personal growth, and actually understood the content better than anyone else in the class, got like a B- in when I was teaching this behavioral ecology class this one semester. And so how could it be that this student earned a B- even though they understood the course content more than anyone else? And the answer is that he didn't give a damn what was on my tests, and he didn't really care much about making the lab assignments fit the rubrics that I was giving. But this guy spent a lot of time reading journal articles in the field, grabbing books. He was excited about animal behavior and what we were doing in this class. And he actually did a lot of reading that grew off of the lectures that we were having in class. Like I'd talk about something, and the next week he'd come talk to me about game theory because he was excited about game theory. And so from my perspective, I failed him as an instructor because the way that the number that I assigned to his performance, what did not actually reflect his personal growth or his learning or even his understanding of the concept, is I had this template of how students are supposed to be performing. And so even if a person is very intellectually inquisitive, that doesn't, or if they might have deep levels of understanding, if they don't know how to write an essay that fits my expectations of what a good essay is, if they don't know how to write an exam answer that fits my expectation of what a good exam answer is, then because I am the grand arbiter of what is successful or not, then I could misevaluate these students. Again, these are structural challenges. Often when we're teaching, we're trying to find excellence, right? To determine who is doing something really well and identify that, reward that, and label that what it is, and we try to foster excellence. But the challenge is, well, what does it mean to be excellent, right? If you have an excellent student, what is that? I'm not kidding. Like and so there's this paper that came out in 2017, which blew my mind. I don't know if you're familiar with this. And so it's university research and the fetishization of excellence. And so basically they look at all kinds of universities and look at how they measure excellence. And ultimately they're saying that it has no meaning. Everyone uses excellence in a different way. In the final analysis, excellence is not excellent. Used in its unqualified form, without explaining what excellence is, it is a pernicious and dangerous rhetoric that undermines the very foundations of good research and scholarship. In other words, something is excellent because they say it's excellent. And if people often don't define what they consider to be excellent, and just by calling something excellent, then it creates a system that supports homophily. Because people say, well, excellence is often what I do or I recognize as excellent. And so you have all these people who recognize something as excellent, but it isn't necessarily. And so what this paper recommends is to ditch the concept of excellence, because simply it is not useful. It doesn't do anything for us. If an institution strives for excellence, what does that get you other than people who agree that they're excellent and you get a high ranking and whatever? But what does that actually accomplish in terms of increasing institutional effectiveness, changing the lives of people, making scientific discovery, educating more people. The concept of excellence does not serve us well. So instead, they were instead replacing it with two other concepts. One, soundness. Is it sound? Right? Is it done well? Not like, is it the bestest ever? But is it good? Does it meet all these criteria? And it turns out that many things that actually are often perceived as excellent aren't even often sound. They don't meet the criteria for soundness. So think about how many papers that get published in Science and Nature, for example, which are super duper and amazing, but then when you look at all the methods and when you look at how it's done, there's all these weaknesses, and then sometimes it'll have to get retracted because people are pushing so hard for the perception of excellence that it's actually not even done well, right? And secondarily, capacity building. And so this is a more useful idea that something, instead of saying that something is excellent, you could say this is something you can build on. This is something that builds capacity. This is something that results in positive change for more people. And so ever since I read this paper, it's changed my lens of how I see everything in higher education, especially teaching. As I'm not looking for students who do things excellently. I'm looking for students who do things soundly, and I'm looking to promote that practice. I'm looking for students who build the capacity for their own personal growth and for the growth of others, and it's a useful framework. So I'd like to spend a little time talking to you about my book and some of these concepts in there, essentially. So I started in 2013 with a blog called Smallpond Science, and what happened was I wrote an essay about lessons for people who are doing research in the context of a teaching-focused institution. So Cal State Dominguez Hills is a primarily undergraduate institution. It's a regional public university. Most of our students are low income and first generation. The institution's about like 10-15% white in terms of student population. Almost everyone's commuters as different as your institution as it could possibly be, I would think. There are a lot of people who are interested in faculty jobs in these kinds of institutions but haven't really spent time at these institutions. So I thought, here are some things that you should know. And I've been blogging there ever since. And eventually that led to me writing a lot about teaching, simple, common sense things about teaching. So I don't do educational research. I study ants, and I'm an ecologist. But I do spend a lot of time reading the discipline-based educational research literature. And so what I found is that there's a lot of folks who, that there's a lot of people in the sciences who are skeptical of educational research, or at least don't dive into the literature, but really want to do evidence-based teaching. And so I would say, here are some evidence-based practices. And so I try to think of myself as attempting to build a bridge between two communities. One community that I'm not a member of. I don't do discipline-based educational research, but I'm trying to get more people like me to be focused on this perspective. And so there's two keystone concepts within this book. So one is teaching efficiently. What does it mean to teach efficiently? And then the other one is the respect principle. So let me just briefly talk about the respect principle. It sounds really straightforward. We should respect our students, right? Like, of course we should respect our students and they should have mutual respect for us. But when you try to carry that out in the classroom on a day-to-day basis, what you find is that the structure of the classroom and all the way that students approach a classroom are built with features that undermine a respectful relationship. And so there's a lot of difficult decisions you would have to make in the course of teaching based on the expectations of us as teachers that could undermine this relationship. So what are some concepts that flow from the respect principle? Our students are fellow learners just like as ourselves. We all have different experiences, different challenges, and different goals. Sorry about that typo. Which means that we have different experiences from our students, but also all of our students will have different experiences and different goals and challenges from one another, right? Our students are not a homogeneous pool, which makes it an instructional challenge. Even though our students might have less experience, they still deserve as much dignity as everyone else. And so oftentimes you see faculty members treat students with less dignity simply because they have familiarity with what the classroom are look like. Students, it's unfair to assume that students should know all of our obscure norms in academia. If the students don't, address us properly in an email, if the student doesn't know exactly when or how to contact us, if they make a request that is we perceive as inappropriate, or maybe they didn't read the syllabus or whatever, then all of a sudden, that's not a reason to treat them with any less respect. And our course is only one small part of their complete life. And our time is just as valuable as their time. And so we should not expect them to devote their entire life to the course, nor should we expect them to do work which is busy work that isn't focused on our learning. So we should not be working harder than our students, but we also should not have expectations of student time that go beyond what is reasonable. Like, you should be able to get an A in a class without, spending your entire life working on it. So, what influences how we teach? Like, we all make so many choices when we enter the classroom, and a lot of the choices we don't realize that we're making. Many of them come from how our professors taught us. That also, people who have experience will give us advice. You could be reading a book by a dude like me. We often have to conform to institutional expectations. A lot of recommendations people will make about teaching would shock your colleagues, or you couldn't do that. And so clearly that's a constraint to work within. We also need to have positive student evaluations, which influences a lot of the choices we make. And also, we learn from our own errors. And so I think this is often how many people learn how to teach on the job, which is wholly appropriate, right? And so what are some other ways that we could use to decide how we teach, right? So as I say in the book, every time we teach, it's like a choose your own adventure with 1,000 choices that we're making, right? And so many of these choices we make by default. And so how could we make these choices more deliberately to respect our students and to take our class where we want it to go? And so we could observe people who are expert teachers. We could develop mentoring relationship people who are successful teachers. We could read the primary literature about teaching. We can create communities of our peers to discuss how to be more effective teachers, and we can have them observe our own classrooms and discuss that. And there are many models for this. You could go to workshops and have other forms of professional development, and then there's the whole outcomes assessment movement approach to teaching as well, which is you look at how you did and you change your course into response to that next semester, where everyone does that to some extent in an informal way for every class you teach more than once. But how much do you choose to formalize that, right? Those are ways to influence how you teach that happen less frequently, but are all straightforward that we can choose. So when you look at, we all put a lot of time and effort into teaching, and some of it is more impactful than others. In general, there's this relationship between instructor effort and student learning outcomes. So in other words, the more work you put into a class, the more the students learn, but there are diminishing returns, right? And so there's some point where if you've spent 8 hours on a lesson, what difference does it make if you put one more hour into that lesson? There are diminishing returns. And so I think teaching efficiently is important, because teaching efficiently meaning that the amount of student learning outcomes, however you would define that, the thing that you're trying to get from the course, is better or good relative to the amount of effort that you put in. And so there are a lot of things that can affect the nature of this curve. So depending on your student population, the course that you're teaching, the choices that you make, the level of the course, then the shape of this curve could be very different. You would really hope that it continues to go up, right? That the more you try, it doesn't drop. But is it a stepwise function? Is it a linear function? Is it an asymptotic function? Is it a logistic growth function? All of these things could vary depending upon what you're doing. I don't think anyone's empirically measured this, right? And so I think it would behoove us to try to make choices that come up with that dark green curve, so that even if we put in a little bit of effort, that it really, really, really works out. And if we added more effort, then it would continue to grow. But ultimately, if we're going to be teaching sustainably, then we would be making choices that would maximize student growth without harming ourselves in the long run, because teaching's hard. So what are the different kinds of choices that you might make that would change how this is structured? You could have, writing intensive classes. How often do you use quizzes? Do you have students do problem sets? Do you have media projects? Do you have a flipping, whatever that is? Do you have specifications grading, or do you do ungrading, which is a whole other thing? There's all other kinds of inquiry-based learning and group learning and active learning approaches that you could use that might change this relationship. Just all these, when you structure your class, when you build your curriculum, what you do will affect the nature of this curve. And I think it's highly individualized. I can't say this thing results in that curve and that thing results in that curve. These colors are not supposed to correspond in any way. But I'm saying is, but these choices that you make can have an impact. Now, there are some things that always take a lot of work that to make difference. I think especially when you're dealing with writing, when you're dealing with like students are writing lab reports or if they're writing essays, to give quality feedback to students and have them improve their writing, it requires work, substantial work from the instructor, and that may very well be worth it. But that's something to be cognizant of, right? So I'd like to, in light of these ideas, let's revisit the idea of what is our purpose in the classroom. Is it to assign grades to students? Is it to support their professional development? Is it to have them learn the course content? Is it to liberate them from the bounds that we have created for them, whatever that might mean, so that we could have them grow beyond the strictures that the institution has set? Or should we be working to build a more equitable community? Or could we do all of these things, right? And are these things in conflict with one another? Do they support one another? Those are difficult questions, and those are ones that you answer, whether you like it or not, by all the choices that you make from the beginning of the semester starts. So my closing and entirely open ended question is, what does it mean to be a fair and equitable teacher? Considering these ideas, considering that all of our students are different from one another, and that our idea of treating people fairly is, might be very different from a student idea of being fairly, and treating people equally is very different from treating people fairly. What does it mean to be a fair and equitable teacher when we all have different goals? Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Terry. One of the things I've been thinking about as you were talking, it seems that what you're saying is that educational institutions are cultural institutions. They're cultures with norms, expectations, behavioral expectations, social expectations, and when students don't conform to them, they can appear to be failures, when in some ways they just don't understand the culture. Do you have any more thoughts about that, as sort of how social culture affects student success?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and so so there's a lot of terms in there that we might that are hard to define. Like, what does student success look like, right? And so we say if a student is not successful because they're getting C's or something, or they're having trouble passing their classes, does that mean that they're not learning? Sometimes, right? And so that's the purpose of what is the education. But I think if the purpose of clearly there's an institutional ethos, right? There's a culture that permeates how faculty choose to teach. And so I'm having taught in different institutions where the overall philosophy of the institution is different, and that creates pressure on how you run your classroom. There are some things that I can do at CSU Dominguez Hills that I essentially wouldn't have been allowed to do at the University of San Diego, or it would have been slightly frowned upon by my department, and so I wouldn't have gotten tenure unless I followed certain practices. And so that's just so students need to, for students to be perceived as being successful, right, then they need to fit into this, to fit into institutional culture. And so what I would be calling on faculty is, especially those who have a position of privilege, would be to create a learning environment where students can succeed independent of what that culture is. So that when students step into your classroom, they're stepping outside of the institutional culture. And instead, you would develop a different kind of culture in your own classroom, and that kind of culture supports individual growth. Now, if let's say you're teaching organic chemistry, then ultimately, right, then you just need to learn how to do these reactions and how to solve these problems, or, and so what does it mean to support student growth in that way? Like, then you'd want to give students different learning pathways to get there. Like that, so even if students, oftentimes the way we teach, we're teaching so in a way that supports the majority of the students, and so there's students who have different kinds of struggles, might not even connect with how we're teaching. So essentially, I guess this is another, the way that people would say this 50 years ago is you need to differentiate instruction, right? You need to have different kinds of instruction for different kinds of students to make sure everyone's needs are being met. But I think ultimately part of that is by rebelling against your institutional culture, to let students know that the way that you're doing things in your class isn't being dictated by the way that your colleagues are expecting you to run your class, and that you don't expect them to behave in any particular way other than being curious and working to learn and to helping meet the goals that you've set out for the class. And so I think one way that, like, either contract grading or specifications grading, I think comes a long way to get there. Where, in other words, if students can develop a proficiency in meeting particular benchmarks, in other words, as long as you can solve these problems, as long as you can perform this task, as long as you can communicate that you're capable of doing these things or understanding these things, I don't care how you do that. You could take this, take the same exam 20 different times, right? And once you show that you have hit a certain level of mastery, then you'll get a particular grade, And so people think that's really straightforward for math, but I think that can work for all kinds of topics. And so that way, as we, students don't have to meet deadlines every week. If they happen to be sick one week, if they have other family challenges or other issues, we're accepting students as they come. And so, and I think ultimately what corrupts this effort are grades, right? And so our job is to grade students. Look at the word grade. It's like, like grading sides of beef, right? That's where the word grading comes from. Or like in other English speaking places, they say marking instead of grading, right? Which seems slightly better. But ultimately, that's what we're doing. We're grading students. And that is pernicious. How is it that ultimately you've graded some students higher than others at the end of the semester? What does that mean? And so that's a structural challenge in higher ed that I don't know how to fix. I think grades are a problem. They get in the way of learning, because students who are trying to earn a grade, a lot of the things they're trying to do to get that grade keep them from actually genuinely learning. And so if we could design our class so that the grade they earn supports their learning, and not only that the grade reflects how much they learned, but the process of trying to get a grade is consistent with the process of learning. But the problem is, like, if the whole, external versus internal motivators of the carrot and the stick, this extrinsic motivator, in general doesn't work, but almost all of higher ed is designed around extrinsic motivators, right? So I don't know if that addresses what you were saying. It doesn't answer your question, but there's me going off on a lot of things I like to talk about, at least.
Well, thank you. That was interesting and thought-provoking. Shigeru?
Terry, thank you so much. Something that I've been thinking about, and some things that you said really kind of reminded me, in a typical classroom, we really don't know our students beyond the assumption that they're somehow academically qualified to be in the classroom. But beyond that, we really don't know them. But once we went online, as all institutions have, most institutions have, what the faculty found was that they were actually looking into the students' private living quarters, their homes. And they started to, they see things that they didn't realize the students were coping with. Often they were having to compete with family members and even with pets for attention. Wi-Fi wasn't working. And so I've had a number of faculty members. I've been interviewing faculty members the last 2 months. A lot of faculty members mentioned to me this new sort of awareness of their students beyond just the academic facet. And I have this impression that once we go back to in class, that faculty on the whole will have a more appreciation of all the struggles that life throws at our students, that they are struggling with on a daily basis, that don't show up in the classroom. And I'm hoping that that will make us into better teachers, that we can teach our students more holistically than just in this narrow band of academics.
Darcy.
Yeah, hi Terry. Small world. I am a former myrmecologist, so I'm familiar with your ecology work.
I remember you.
Yeah. So I'm really curious about this kind of falsehood or false promise of excellence, and especially in an environment like MIT, where excellence is a source of pride. Where not only as individuals, but as an institution, and there's a lot of kind of cultural significance that excellence takes on. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how to pivot towards prioritizing soundness and capacity building while also maintaining kind of a strong cultural identity towards this concept of rigor or excellence.
Yeah, so it's a challenge. So yeah, clearly coming to like MIT to do the speak truth to power, to being like, well, what the hell is excellence, when literally, like, and so my spouse works for Cal Tech, and so same level of rhetoric that you see, when they just put a robot on Mars, right? Like, that requires some level of excellence to do that potentially, or very sound work at least. And so that's like, and so meanwhile, coming from a place like Dominguez Hills, like, what we see is that rhetoric of excellence is basically weaponized against us, because excellence ultimately is where you're ranking institutions, right? Literally, excellence is where you are in the ranks. And if you're higher in the rank, then you are more excellent. And so an institution like mine with few resources is always going to be ranked near the bottom, because there's such a tight association between your endowment and that ranking, right? I mean, that's the way the world works. And so I think, I don't know, because it requires the institution to have some deep soul searching and a new identification of what one's identity is. What is MIT if it's not excellent, right? I would say, I would hope to think that its ability to influence the world, right? Its ability to create capacity and to send people on to new careers that are impactful, and the idea that you're doing things very well and that you're a model for things for highly sound work, right? And so I think if you were to abandon the rhetoric of excellence, then what you see is you have an institution that does things in a very sound manner, and you do things that create more capacity. And ultimately, a lot of that is capacity building. All that endowment is used to create even more endowment, which results in more capacity. But what you do see are extraordinary ethical lapses, right? Sometimes. And misuse of resources and people being abused. I'm reading the paper and I see what happens, right? Certain famous people in the news associated with the institution and all that. And so, and that behavior is enabled by the rhetoric of excellence, because because you're pushing for excellence, which is about excellence is about perception rather than what happens, right? Whereas if you focus on the goods rather than what's happened, and so if you measure excellence by number of publications, if you measure excellence by the size of your endowment, if you measure excellence by the number of people who are members of the National Academy or Nobel Prizes or stuff like that, right? Then you know, what's the every once a measure becomes a target, then that becomes a perverse incentive, right? And so that rhetoric of excellence means you're always going to be having some perverse incentive to shoot for that target for whatever you define that target as excellence is. And so I don't know how to do that, but because I don't spend much time in institutions like that. I've never even been to Boston. Even no one's invited me to Harvard yet, for example. Like so, and so I don't know how to do that. But I'm saying is as long as that rhetoric exists, then it punishes students at institutions like mine who will always perceive to be less than excellent. But the reason that some of my students are not at MIT is not that they're not capable of being there. It's simply because their family didn't even think that they could go to college, you know, much less something in the UC system, or, you know, like they're lucky to be at CSU Dominguez Hills based on their environment. And so, I guess I see this rhetoric as so useless and so punishing. I don't even know how to get out of it. But it's an environment that you're trapped in, right? If that helps, it answers your question.
I think it is really helpful insight into thinking about the way that we talk about our work and the way that we perceive kind of how we approach things. I think it was very helpful.
Thank you, Darcy.
I'm thinking about the student you mentioned who learned so much, but who got a B minus, I think. And I'm wondering what you personally, how you personally have changed the way you grade your courses in order to more accurately reflect learning.
Yeah. Part of it is, so I still have exams, but I think but what I do now is my exams are far more like open in structure. And so what I do is I give out to my students 2 weeks before the exam all the questions that will be on the exam. So there are no surprises for students. And so oftentimes what I think is that student grades, like students' ability to do well, is that they are good at gamesmanship, right? They are academically savvy. And so students who can guess what the professor is going to put on the exam are going to do well. And the students who don't have the same mindset as this professor, who can't guess what are going to be on the exam, they'll end up studying the wrong thing. And so I explode that by saying, here are 10 questions. 3 of these are going to be essay questions on the exam. Or some other, like, or that would be like an upper division class. In a lower division class, I would have a review sheet that has like 30 or 40 items. And I will say every question on this exam will be drawn from these 30 or 40 items. And if you come to me in the exam and can credibly say, oh my God, I didn't know this was going to be on the exam, then I will remove that question from the exam and everyone gets full credit for it, right? Because have total transparency over what I'm expecting from students, right? And so then so that way, I'm not punishing anyone who culturally doesn't understand higher education enough to know how I might be running my class. Another thing I would do is I give more opportunity for students to do projects. I also basically have got all of my deadlines are recommended, and so if a student, so that way if a student wants to turn in something later, they can. Also, I still use rubrics to evaluate student writing, but my rubrics are structured so that I have the ability to reward people who are curious and are but risk-taking in a good way. That to demonstrate intellectual curiosity and personal growth rather than meeting my preconceived expectation of performance. And so ultimately I find myself giving high scores to things that historically I would have given low scores to, because my grading rubric on the assignments recognizes the effort or the thought that went into what they did, essentially. It also really depends on the class that I'm teaching. I hope that helps. I would like to not give grades at all, other than, or like there's this relatively new book that came out, Ungrading, that talks about structures, ways that we can run our classes so that students can have some kind of feedback about what their grade should be, and then it starts a conversation about whether or not they earn that and what they can do to earn that. And so students set their own goals; they can see how well they meet their own goals in context with us. And so ultimately, if it's a math class, then it's like, can you be able to solve these kinds of equations or whatever? But at the same time, if the students are able to um, have more than one way of demonstrating competence. I guess ultimately what it boils down to is I give students different avenues to demonstrate competence. And so if a student, if on a final exam, if a student gets an A on the final exam, then they get an A in the class, right? If that no matter what else they did, because that shows that they mastered it, Or if there's if I have a major essay that communicates that or a big term paper that communicates understanding of what we're doing in the whole semester, then again that could potentially be their whole grade. So I'm still experimenting with this, and actually lately I've been stepping out of the classroom for admin stuff, and so the more I think hard about this, I haven't had as much opportunity to, put my philosophy to the road as much as I'd like. But also keep in mind that all these things have to be structured by the environment that we're in, is realistic. That our colleagues have expectations of us and students have expectations of us. So it's not like there's any one way of doing this. And so I can't say, here's the way to teach, right? You need to find that pathway based on what works in your own environment, in your student population. I just encouraging people to realize that their student population is probably more variable than they realize.
Thank you for that question, Byron. Shigeru, would you like to comment?
Just in terms of grades, Terry, when we went online last March, a year ago, we put in policy of pass, no record. Okay, so it's a very, very generous a policy. Yeah. And again, I interviewed a bunch of faculty members, and most of them were really excited by this policy. It was very humane. Because we didn't know what was going to happen, right? We've never taught online before. They also said how freeing that was, that they were able to do assignments, open-ended assignments, for which they didn't feel the need to, distinguish between B plus and A minus and those kinds of things. And so it was a liberating policy. But interestingly, complaints came from students. Students who are shooting for law school and medical school wanted grades, and they felt that they're being shortchanged because of this. We stayed with a policy for spring semester. I think we went back to regular grading policy in the fall, but it was for a moment in history. It was a very interesting time when we had a really interesting experiment going on that affirms a lot of what you said, but because of societal conventions like medical school and law school needing grades, we've gone back.
Yeah, and the same thing in our institution. Like, so this semester we just changed the policy so students can switch to a W, like even at the end of the semester, like even in June, right when their grades are coming out. If they know they're going to get a DRF, they can choose a W if they want. But the same thing, a lot of students, so they're like, we're all trapped in the system that, grades students, that rates students, right? That just shows how problematic grades are. Yeah, thank you. That's a really good point. And I mean, what lesson can be learned for this for med schools and law schools and grad schools when they're trying to identify what quality is and what their values are, especially now that it looks like the GRE is going to be done everywhere or almost everywhere now, right? Which means that we're going to be looking at probably scrutinizing grades even more, and students who have a lot of privilege are probably going to do just as well or even better than before in relative terms, because people who happen to test well, that won't help them. And so, it's a mess.
On that unhappy note, thank you so much, Terry. This was amazing. We are at the end of
Thank
the
you.
hour. Really appreciated what you shared and your insights. And thanks everybody for coming. Really appreciated it. Thanks again. Take care, everybody.
All right. Thank you very much.